and welcome to High Score, an ongoing series of videos analysing and considering the use of sound and music in video games. Today, I'm looking at the latest entry in the Animal Crossing series, Animal Crossing New Horizons, for the Nintendo Switch. Animal Crossing is a series of life sim games in which you play as the only humanoid living in a village of animal residents. The games have no hard goals or objectives, there's no final boss or secret levels. Instead, players are free to cultivate friendships with other villagers, fish and catch bugs, and decorate their homes. In later games, they can even decorate and design the layout of their island. Or not. Players are free to do as much or as little as they like. The customization options available to players have expanded throughout the series, and New Horizons represents a very clear peak. Players can decorate their homes, choose from a massive selection of avatar options, customise clothes and furniture, cultivate plants, interact with visiting merchants and other animals, and even build or demolish their island's geography as they please. It's by far the most interactive entry in the series. Animal Crossing uses the system clock to advance the in-game time of day. So a player opening the game at 8 AM will find that it's 8 AM in their village. A player logging on at 6:30 at night will find the in-game time matches their surroundings. Not only is Animal Crossing's gameplay unique, but the fashion in which the soundtrack is incorporated into the player's experience is also notable. Different tracks are used at different times of day, and each notable location has its own music. Certain characters, such as Tom Nook, have even had their themes develop as they take on new roles in each game. What's new to this game, however, is the presence of diegetic and non-diegetic music, ambience, and how the soundtrack is used to shape the player's long-term experience. I think that this game uses sound in a slightly different way to how the previous entries in the series did, and I'll try to explain my reasoning in this video. Time goes by. The most notable feature of the game's soundtrack is, perhaps surprisingly, its regular background music. These tracks change on the hour, every hour, and the same track plays at the same time every day. By hearing the same track at the same time repeatedly, the player will begin to associate it with that time of day. If the player follows a consistent schedule every day, they'll become more familiar with some tracks than others. For example, I'm much more familiar with the 10 PM music than I am, say, with the 3 AM track. By tying each track to a particular time, the soundtrack offers consistency to the player. This is important, as regular gameplay can vary quite a bit between any 2 days. Additionally, one of 3 motifs taken from the game's main theme can be found in every hourly track. This creates a coherence, tying these tracks to the game itself. They're related to each other and share a common theme, instead of just being 24 tracks composed at random. At no point do these tracks interrupt the player's gameplay. The most obtrusive they get is the point at which they change, when a short, player-designed jingle plays, signalling the hour before the new track begins. They are deliberately designed not to be noticed or required in any way. As such, players can play with the game muted or in low volume, and not miss out on any major gameplay features. The game features a weather system for the player's island, and when it rains or snows, the hourly tracks are altered slightly. The rain brings a softer sound, with an added xylophone, while the snow adds a glockenspiel and the odd jingle every now and then. These changes mean that the tracks fade even further out of the player's attention span. They continue to match the ever-changing island environment so well that, whether the player has the volume up or down, they most likely won't be conscious of the music while they play. Do you remember? The game elicits nostalgia to enhance the emotional impact felt by the player at various points during gameplay. There are a few different ways in which the game does this, but first, let's clear up what nostalgia actually is. The Cambridge Dictionary defines nostalgia as a feeling of pleasure and also slight sadness when you think about things that happened in the past. Usually when someone feels nostalgia for a game, they're actually nostalgic for the context in which they first played that game. That's why games first played as a child are often looked upon fondly, regardless of their objective quality, cough cough, Ocarina of Time. With this definition in mind, I split the game's uses of nostalgia into two categories. Internal nostalgia is formed by impressions made within the game you're playing. In terms of Animal Crossing, this could be turning on the game late at night and hearing a theme that you haven't heard in a long time, or listening to a KK Slider track that you first heard during a particularly important part of your life. Internal nostalgia is most often found in players new to a game or series. External nostalgia is formed by impressions made by other games. This might be hearing a track in-game which you first heard elsewhere, online for example. External nostalgia is more commonly found in players with previous experience of a series. One of the landmarks available to the player in the early stages of the game is Resident Services. This is a hub in which the player can access various mechanics, such as their island rating or major decoration features. To unlock the Resident Services building, they must first meet various objectives, such as planting enough flowers or crafting a ladder and vaulting pole. It's as close as the game gets to a tutorial. The construction of the Resident Services building also triggers the previously mentioned hourly tracks to begin playing. Before this point, a single track titled Prologue plays at all times. The track stays mostly identical, but develops a little to mark small achievements as goals are met. This is the first variation, which plays as you step off the plane onto the island for the first time. And this is the seventh variation, which plays in the days before you unlock Resident Services. By now, over a year after release, most players will have progressed past this prologue track. Even new players will eventually reach the point where the early tracks begin. There's no in-game method to hear it again. Once it's gone for good. As such, many players won't have heard it for over a year. So when they do hear it, be it through YouTube or by starting a new island, they'll be hit with a wave of internal nostalgia. They'll think of what their island looked like when they last heard the track and how much it's changed in the time since. In other games, players are often encouraged to form a connection with their avatar. Doing so makes the game's narrative feel more important and the characterization more effective. I've talked a lot about this in a previous video, so make sure to check that out if you're interested. New Horizons, though, is a bit different. Yes, the player does have a customizable avatar, and one with extensive options at that, including skin, hair and eye colour. But I would argue that the player's avatar isn't what they're primarily encouraged to bond with. Instead, I think the island itself is the primary connection to the player. After all, they're constantly encouraged to design it, decorate it, renovate it, make it their own. They even get to name it. Even the most unimaginative player will likely make some changes. By customising their island, the player is adding their own personality to it. An island is only completed once the player has touched every part of it. And so when the prologue theme triggers nostalgia, not only does it create a nostalgia for the player's real life context, but also for the journey they've experienced in designing their island. They'll look at their work and feel proud, encouraged, elated. This internal nostalgia acts as a reward for their hard work. Resident Services also relates to the idea of external nostalgia. Listen to the building's theme. Now, listen to an excerpt from the previous game, Animal Crossing New Leaf. This is Isabelle's theme. Hear the similarity? Now listen to another section of the Resident Services theme. And now, Tom Nook's theme from another previous game, Wild World. Resident Services combines the themes of Tom Nook and Isabelle, the two characters running the building. To a new player, this has no material impact. The music is just nice elevator music for a location they'll spend a good amount of time in. For veterans, however, this track is a reference to previous games. They're given a nod of the head, if you like, from the developers. The external nostalgia created by this mashup rewards veteran players while not punishing new players. Perfectly balanced. Given the game is a life sim, you would expect its sound design to be fairly limited. Well, you'd be wrong, and massively so. New Horizons' sound design is impeccable and adds to the overall player experience in so many different ways. Ambience exists everywhere in the game. Rivers trickle by, waves break on the beaches, waterfalls thunder over cliffs. You can even hear wind whistling through trees on particularly windy days. Indoors, you can hear a low hum, which is often associated with heating and electrical systems. No matter where you are in-game, there's always something to hear. This ambience creates a constant base, a blanket on which the rest of the soundtrack can build. If the player travels to the beach, the background music fades. This highlights the sound of waves rolling into shore. It also fades for a similar effect on the back two tiles and the third level of your island. When sneaking up on bugs or baiting fish, the music fades to help the player concentrate. In fact, they may be so focused that they don't immediately notice it's happened. Most user actions, like digging up a fossil or catching a fish, trigger a cartoon-like sound effect. Even non-productive actions, like whacking your shovel against a wall, creates a loud clang while your avatar bounces backwards. The contrast between player actions and ambience puts extra emphasis on you, the player, and what you do. The island's ambience represents the automatic part of the game, the advancing clock and weather systems. But the player actions are raised a level above this, because they're what's most important. Finally, I'd like to point out the game's user interface sound effects. These also don't interfere with or distract from gameplay. They're just incredibly satisfying and make navigating the numerous menus and catalogues enjoyable. In addition, some of them, like the pocket sound, pan left and right along with the player's pointer. You found me. Of course, everything we've talked about so far is fairly standard. Most video games have a soundtrack of some sort, and many will change and adapt as the player advances. Sound effects are everywhere too, even in the most basic of menus. So, what sets New Horizons apart from other games? Discovery. Players are on a constant sonic adventure, stumbling across new tracks and unlocking new music wherever they go. Special events are celebrated throughout the year and often parody real-life celebrations. For example, Toy Day takes place on the 24th of December and sees the player handing out presents to each of their villagers on behalf of the reindeer Jingle. Sound familiar? Another event in April, Bunny Day, sees the player battle against hordes of invading balloons and eggs, ultimately fighting off the evil rabbit Zipper T. Bunny and spoiling his plans to take over the world. Like I said, art imitates life. These events each have their own special tracks, which take priority over the regular hourly music. For example, here's the music that plays in the run-up to the New Year celebrations. These tracks match the theme of the event. The new year is exciting and builds towards midnight. Bunny Day marks the beginning of spring. Halloween is spooky, but still silly. In addition, the departure from regular tracks signals to the player that something special is happening. The real heart of the game's soundtrack, though, is in the casual discoveries. There are a bunch of different tracks that play in special circumstances, which the player has to stumble upon. They're not signposted in any way. In his video on the game's soundtrack, Scruffy describes the sense of discovery really well. He says, "Music in the game is a series of discoveries that rewards curiosity and diligence to the game's progression. Simply by playing the game, players will come across new tracks that they wouldn't otherwise hear. The prime example of this is one of the game's most popular tracks. Nook's Cranny is the game's general store. In it, the player can buy furniture, tools, flowers, and other items. For most of the day, it plays a nice, cheery track, reflecting the nature of the shop and its staff, to Mini Tanuki. However, should the player happen to be in the store just before its closing time, they'll hear this. The music changes to a much lighter, slower, and more expressive version of the shop's theme. This isn't mentioned anywhere, nor is the shop's closing time highlighted particularly often, but a dedicated player is bound to stumble across it eventually. In doing so, this track is their reward. The progression from the prologue music to the early tracks could also be considered as a reward. By completing the tutorial section, the player is rewarded with 24 new tracks. The museum also upgrades after a certain point, unlocking new music for each of its exhibits. After upgrading resident services and bringing your island to a certain level, KK Slider, the K9 Ed Sheeran, will begin visiting your island. Once a week, he'll perform from his library of songs, all of which parody real-life genres. This is the final major milestone in the game. After this point, the player is truly left to their own devices. KK returns once a week, a recurring reward for the player's dedication. Discoveries like these are all well and good, but why are they important? Why do I think that New Horizons' soundtrack is perfectly designed for its purpose? It all comes back to longevity. A game like Animal Crossing can only keep the player's attention for so long before it becomes repetitive and boring. In some ways, New Horizons has more hooks to do this with than any other previous game in the series. In other ways, such as the lack of new updates and features, it's severely lacking. The music, however, falls into the former category. By constantly surprising the player with new discoveries, the soundtrack invigorates them, encourages them to carry on playing, at least for a little while. New tracks not only provide fresh music for the player to listen to, but the act of finding them is satisfying too. The drive to collect each of KK Slider's singles draws the player back week after week. Conclusion. I don't know if it's been obvious throughout the video, but I really like this game's soundtrack. I think everything from the music to the sound effects are designed perfectly. By changing tracks every hour, the player begins to associate certain themes and musical personalities with the time of day. This can help them arrange their activities in-game, while also keeping them aware of the constant passage of time. Each track also ties back into the game's overall main theme. The game uses different types of nostalgia to reward veteran players returning to the series and to highlight the player's progress over long periods of time. No matter where the player is or what they're doing, they'll be able to hear ambience around them. This could be quiet or loud, but it serves as a reminder that the island is a dynamic being with factors at play out with the player's control. Contrasting this ambience are the player's actions. These are louder and less serious, often involving silly fanfares or non-realistic sound effects. This gives priority and a sense of importance to the player's actions. Finally, the game uses discovery and encourages diligence and curiosity to entice the player back when burnout would otherwise have taken hold. Discovering new tracks or sound effects gives the player a sense of reward and can also signify their continuing progress. While the game may have disappointed many in some respects, the soundtrack has clearly been polished to a very high standard. It does a fantastic job of holding players' interest for long periods of time, whilst also encouraging them to continue exploring and progressing through the game's limited goals. In terms of overall Sonic design in video games, I think this is one of the best. That's all I've managed to squeeze into this video. There's a bunch more I could have talked about in relation to this game, but I think what's been covered here does the majority of the soundtrack justice. I hope you've enjoyed this dive into the Deserted Island Getaway package, and I'll catch you in the next video.